Welcome, welcome. This is a very special edition of the Soul of the Nation. We are here at our new Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown on the eve of our Test of Faith, a summit to defend democracy. And I am just delighted to have the co-hosts of the Convocation Unscripted podcast available to you on YouTube. Here they are. We talk a lot together, but here we are, all speakers at this conference, and here we are face to face. We don't always see each other face to face too often, so I'm just blessed to have you all here. With me are Diana Butler-Bass, historian, speaker, and author of the Cottage newsletter. We got her out of the cottage today. Kristin Dumais, who is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University and fellow at the University of Notre Dame Center for the Philosophy of Religion. You kind of do it all, religion, philosophy. Robbie Jones, president of PRRI, the data we all turn to. We're just talking all the time. And Jemar Tisby, author and historian. Now, these folks all have written many books. It would take too long to name them all, but look up their books. I'm honored to be joined by dear friends here today in our new space. So, to all of you, I'd like each of you to speak about what is at the heart of your concerns about this upcoming election and the implications for faith and faith communities now and going forward. What do we learn from the Bible, especially Jesus, about faith and politics at a time like this? What do we learn? What does that mean? Does it apply? What moments can we learn from in church history? Historians are here. We're full of historians in the panel. How is this a moment in church history? Is it? Will we look back on this as that kind of moment? How do we love our neighbors? How do we love our neighbors in this election? Those who are different from us are going to be very different views than us. And how do we talk to our neighbors? How do we love them and talk to them, which we often don't do very well? As Christians, we are Christians, so our ultimate allegiance is to Jesus. How do we keep Jesus center in the vortex of this hyper-partisan, conflictual world? So anyone can start. What is the urgency that is hitting you most strongly? Anyone can start. Go ahead.
Just this morning, I was feeling overwhelmed because there is urgency to this election. But the piece that really struck me today was that, even if Donald Trump isn't elected and say he goes away, this whole problem about the nature of democracy and the role of Christianity and democracy is not going to go away. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been underscored for me this week by the whole terrible thing that's been going on in Springfield, Ohio. And the demonization of immigrants and the J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate, literally saying on CNN that they invented a story in order to get press attention, and that it's a story having real life consequences on the lives of children, people who are already sort of at the edges and margins of society as refugees from a violent political situation in Haiti, and folks who are basically working class people in Springfield, Ohio. And there's a kind of moral corruption to that affects me very deeply. And I found myself crying actually this morning when I was on my morning walk and realizing that it's not just about an election, it's about facing down something that has become very ugly in our midst.
When we first heard that during the last debate, the question that came to mind for me was, who does Donald Trump lie most about? Again and again and again. Immigrants, refugees, those seeking asylum. You go through that, it's not just a lie, it's again and again and again. And what came up for me was Matthew 25, where Jesus says, how you treat the stranger, and the word in the text means immigrant, refugee, is how you treat me. I was waiting for all these preachers to preach to Matthew 25. Let's start with that. I mean, let's talk about, we were talking about that before. This is archetypal of what we're facing now.
Well, yeah, we were talking earlier, but it just seems to be such a failure of Christian theology, right? I keep looking for the place where Christian theological commitments are going to make a difference. Like where they're going to hold somebody back, where they're going to make somebody speak up at risk to themselves, right? On behalf of, I mean, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, like these are the people we're supposed to be speaking up for, right? And instead, they're overtly lying, admitting they're lying, right? Against people who are vulnerable, right? And it's just like the antithesis, right, of, the Christian thing that we're called to do. And I got a seminary degree, and like I grew up, as this Southern Baptist world, and the idea was that you hold these theological principles, they shape your moral character, and they put some guardrails up for like what you are willing to do and not do in your life, right? And that is just utterly absent here.
Jemar, what do you think about that?
This is a time for first principles. We are so many people caught up on what's the particular policy or the line or the what. What's at stake right now is the peaceful transfer of power, period. If we don't have that, then all of the policy talk is off the table. And I don't think a lot of people who were born and raised in the US understand just how chaotic governments can get, because we've never had to deal with the kind of tyrannies and tumult that some other countries face. But we're at a point where, it could happen here, and it could happen in the very next election. Wouldn't happen maybe all at once, but that opens the floodgates for whatever could come next. So at this point, I consider myself an evangelist for democracy. Just like, listen, y'all, I get it. You've got issues with both sides, which is a line I hate. But can we at least say we're going to have a candidate who abides by the vote, abides by whatever the outcome is, and sticks by that? And can we at least have a candidate who has minimum basic character? I mean, this shouldn't even be a race. First of all, Trump shouldn't even be running, in my opinion, as a convicted felon, as someone who helped foment an insurrection. What kind of bonkers world do we live in where he's a legitimate candidate for one of the two major parties? That shouldn't even happen. But if that is going to happen, then it shouldn't even be a choice. So that's where I am right now.
Oh, same. What everybody said, what Jemar has said, that phrase just keeps ringing through my mind. It can't happen here, because it can. And yet there's so much complacency, and complacency turns to complicity. Right now within Christian communities, there are bad actors, and we may end up talking more about those in just a bit, but there are bad actors in a number of religious spaces right now, religious and political spaces, who are orchestrating essentially a takeover of the federal government. We are in unprecedented territory, at least in my lifetime, And what Jemar was saying about the next election is absolutely key. But then it's not just that, right? We can lose any time, but we can't win in the next election and make this all go away. And so we're in this for the long haul. But we've got a lot of bad actors who are very strategic and are fomenting this essentially reactionary populist movement and bringing in huge swaths of faith communities across the country. And then you have, I think, an even bigger swath of complacent Christians who might hear about democracy and think that's overreacting, who might want to choose this both sides path, who might want to present themselves as I'm above partisan politics. And what we're trying to say is, great. Let's shore up the foundations of our democracy. And then you can go back to that both sides, nonpartisan, whatever it may be. But this moment is demanding something different.
So bomb threats, schools closing in Springfield, hospitals, threats against individuals, a Republican governor, Republican mayor saying this isn't true, and yet the lying is about immigrants who are different racially than the base being spoken to. Now this is where it gets for all of us deeper than politics. Every nation has its better angels and its worst demons. And our demons of race run very deep in this country. So, Jemar, you're a historian. You're in and of the Black church, but you also come from this evangelical space. It's been quite a journey.
Quite a journey.
How do you see this atmosphere? Who they're lying about and why, and how all the efforts to voter suppression or whatever are really about, in a single sentence, how to prevent changing demography from changing our democracy. How do you see that? How is race and the relation between Black and white Christians, which you're in the middle of all the time?
Yeah, absolutely. The damage done to the racial reconciliation movement in the church because of Trumpism and MAGA cannot be calculated. I was deep in it. I was waving the banner and I was going to evangelical spaces that were predominantly white, whether, websites and writing or their churches or conferences. I was a standard bearer to say, yes, we should have that Revelation 5:9, 7:9 vision, all tribes, tongue, and nations right here, right now. And then came 2016 and 81% of white evangelicals who voted, pulling the lever. And then that number staying consistent after we saw 4 years of that presidency. And most of the Black folks I know are just like, okay, we're done with this racial reconciliation thing. And what also burdens me politically is the refusal to name the thing. So when you said, who does Trump most often lie about? Yes, refugees, immigrants, but certain kinds.
That's right. From
certain countries. Black and brown folks, right? He's not complaining about Norway or France or something. Yeah, he'd like them. So this is the historic U.S. problem, the refusal to look racism dead on, acknowledge how salient and relevant it continues to be, and to deal with it on its own terms. So, if our nation doesn't persist as a democratic republic, then we will have to look at the role race and racism played in that.
I just had a conversation in North Carolina with a white megachurch pastor, very charismatic, very successful, wanted to have lunch, he and his friends. And I said, how do you feel about your congregants voting for a party that in North Carolina is specifically targeting on suppressing the votes of your Black brothers and sisters in Christ? He said, that's not happening in North Carolina. When the North Carolina Supreme Court looked at some of those restrictions and their language, not mine, it was surgically focused on Black voters. So this blind eye, it's really a white blind eye. And how is white obliviousness key to white supremacy.
Yeah, go for it.
I was really struck by when we went around at the beginning and we were talking about things that were bothering us. Every single person at this table mentioned something about lying. And this past Sunday, the lectionary text that was shared in mainline Protestant churches and in Catholic churches was the Epistle of James, the tongue is a fire. And so I preached on this text, knowing what was going on in Springfield. And I asked the pastor in advance, I said, can I talk about Springfield, Ohio? And this pastor has preached on Gaza, so I was on pretty safe ground, I thought, preaching about Springfield. So I preached a sermon using James about the lie, and talked about race, and talked about refugees, and really it was probably the closest thing to a barn burner sermon that I have ever preached in my entire life. And afterwards, this man comes up to me and he said, I really think that you were too hard on Donald Trump. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, this is kind of bothering me in Ohio, but people are saying that this really happened.
A lot of people are saying.
That's what he did. He actually said a lot of people are saying that this really happened. And so I actually went, and this goes to that question of white supremacy and also American history. I said, did you know that in the 1840s, a lot of people were saying that Catholic priests were kidnapping young girls, putting them in convents in order to rape them, and if they got pregnant, would take their infants, kill the infants, ground their bodies up, and then use the bodies of those infants for the host.
Good.
And I said, a lot of people were saying that in the 1840s. Do you think that's true? And he looks at me and he's just like, didn't even know how to answer it. I said, did you know that in the 1890s, a lot of people were saying that the Lakota in South Dakota had a purposeful plot to murder every single white person who walked into the state and tried to put up a farm or build a house or what have you, and that resulted in the massacre at Wounded Knee. And then finally I said the last piece, I said, did you know that many white people in the 1920s thought that black men were oversexed and that they would just rape white women at will? And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, many people believed that a young black man raped a white woman and it resulted in the death of hundreds of people and the destruction. I said, so many people believed all those things. And all those things are about race, about religious superiority, about white supremacy. Many people believed them. And he just looked at me and he said, so you're saying that this is not true? And I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Because American history is full of people in power who said lies about people who were somehow marginalized, usually by race, often by religion, in order to maintain their power.
And many people who believed those things back then didn't have the internet. And now I've heard people say, well, I've heard this isn't true, but it's all over the internet. So it's a whole new situation where we have different universes, different factual universes. Robbie, you look at data all the time on these things, like what people are hearing and listening to. Now, this is like what people are listening to, they're putting out all over the place. And someone told me this morning, all she has to do is go to her mother's nursing home and talk to her mother's friends about all they're hearing from each other and on the internet about all these things. And if there's no accountability to facts and truth, you see it all the time.
Yeah. And you hear that, like, we're going to create stories, right? And because they know this is not accidental, right? I mean, these were networks created specifically for this purpose, right? Fox News, for example, you can see it in the data that Republicans who, for example, who watch Fox News are far more extreme. They're far more likely to be Christian nationalists. They're far more likely to support Donald Trump. They're far more likely to support political violence. They're far more likely to be authoritarian. All of this stuff, right? Then Republicans who watch anything else, like as their primary source of, and most trust some other primary source of news. So that you could see the effect, and that's not even to get into the like troll farms and stuff that are running the kind of social media world, right? That are kind of just amplifying these little threads and kind of creating a whole tsunami of misinformation and disinformation that we're all, kind of wrapping our heads around. One other brief comment, though, I just want to kind of dovetail on Diana's thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, it takes an enormous amount of energy to hide our history. And we're seeing like the extreme efforts that people will go to keep a lid on the history that they do not want the next generation or the previous or the current generation to hear. But like, I've just been so struck by like, if you just look at pick a town, like pick a city, pick a map, and you just look at the map and like what's so the obvious thing that we're so used to turning a blind eye to, and a white blind eye to, is that like the way I keep saying it is we're the survivors of an apartheid state. If you look at the map and you see the Native American names like on the rivers, on the mountains, on the towns, and you look at the towns and you see a railroad track or a river, right? And the white people live over here and the non-white people live over there. Like none of that is accidental, right? And we're living as if that was normal, right? And we're living as if white Christian churches and people in power didn't bless that order of things. And I think that's what's at stake too.
And making a lot of money off of it.
Of course. I mean, yeah.
Along the way.
Yeah.
Which is in Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, where there are actual railroad tracks. Divide one county from another, black and white. And it's symbolic of what's happening all over North Carolina and all over the country. But the railroad tracks became such a powerful metaphor and symbol of what's happening everywhere. Yeah. So what about the evangelicals? People ask me and Kristin all the time. We're from that tradition. You're a historian. How do you view this moment in history? And what diversity is there or not in the evangelical world around all these things? And is there a generational difference going on?
First of all, what are the dynamics that we see there in the evangelical world? And what we see is consistent support for MAGA politics. We just have to be very clear. The latest poll puts it at 82%. So it's been right around there for almost a decade now, right? As long as we have been polling the support for Trump. So it's important to put that on the table. That does leave 18-19% that we could talk about, and that's where you would place yourself. You've been around for a long time in that minority position. And, so what is the theology motivating these folks? And I think we have to look at, in our statement on Christian faith and democracy, we are trying to call Christians back to a broader, deeper theological tradition. Imago Dei, the image of God. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. The reality of sin is something that I like to talk about. The reality of sin, not as being out there, those guys, the other, but the sin that pervades the Christian community and Christian individuals and Christian churches and Christian political movements, which I find sorely lacking in most evangelical approaches to politics. And this is actually foundational to what we have come to call Christian nationalism. It's this us versus them mentality, where we are doing God's will, and therefore anybody who opposes us at any level is an enemy of God. And this is exactly how that rhetoric goes. And therefore, whatever I do has God's blessing because I am doing God's work. And therefore, I can do whatever I want to achieve my ends, which are God's ends. And this justifies overt lying. This justifies cruelty. This justifies all sorts of immoral activity. And, I talked before, drawing on Niebuhr, on spiritual malformation that this instills. And I see that happening throughout the evangelical community. Now, there's a temptation for all of us to go in that direction. And I mean, our system of government is set up with checks and balances, these guardrails you were talking about, right? These kind of guardrails. We can have moral guardrails. We can have political guardrails to protect us against our baser instincts. And what I've been seeing in the evangelical community is there is a powerful movement that is trying to absolutely decimate those guardrails, that is leaning into this Christian nationalist agenda and then selling it as the Christian approach to politics. If you are a Christian, you are with us. If you are against us, you are not a Christian. And they are making life absolutely miserable for the Christian leaders who stand up against it. And that is their specific strategy, their tactic, which just happens to be, I'll say as a historian here, straight out of the authoritarian playbook as well. Right. Ruthlessly attacking in-group moderates.
So you're saying evangelicals are not taking sin seriously.
I am saying they have to look at their own sin, the humility that all of us need.
Can I just say, as a Southern Baptist, right, who grew up in that world, like, you might think that for a denomination that got race and slavery and segregation so damn wrong, that you might want to take a hiatus for a few years or a few decades on pronouncing your righteousness and your lockhold on the truth, capital T, right? Yeah, that's all I'll say.
You might.
Go ahead.
No.
So where is and how is this being discussed? Now, as your data shows, Robbie, that a majority of white Christians, not just evangelicals, but mainline and Catholic, the majority of white Christians voted the last two elections, majorities for Donald Trump. Is that changing or not? Do you find, in your mainline world, do you find pastors finding the courage to stand up and speak up? Or are they afraid of the pushback they're going to get? What does the data show, and what does your relationship show about those pastors?
Well, the data piece will be very quick. No, we're not seeing any movement at all. Pew's got new numbers out. PRI's about to have new numbers out that I've already looked at. I can tell you there is no movement. It is 8 and 10 white evangelicals, 6 and 10 white non-evangelical Protestants, and 6 and 10 white Catholics still supporting Trump. And his favorability numbers, right? So it's one thing to say, that's an action I'm going to take in political space. But his favorability numbers among white evangelicals are in the 70s. Like, you favor the person, like what your favorable view of them. So there's just no movement at all. And again, to sort of put it in historical context, what we're looking at here is that since the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, that's what set us on the course that we have today. And it has been white Christians supporting Republican candidates at the top of the ticket, and kind of everybody else supporting Democratic tickets in presidential elections. And the thing that set us on that course was the passage of the Civil Rights Act, where there was a great white Christian flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party that coalesced in the 80s with Reagan and has been solid ever since. So Trump is like accentuating this, but this was a kind of racially reactive course that defined our political parties in racial lines before Trump ever, came on the scene.
So this summer, I got to speak to a number of black pastors and preachers at the Haley Farm in Tennessee. And I said, how many of you have white sister churches? And they all raised their hands. That's where you swap a pastor and a choir once a year. I said, how about if you were to say to your white church partners, let's have a conversation between your church and mine about the teachings of Jesus in this election year. Let's have a conversation about what did Jesus say. Jesus isn't partisan, but what are the values that we derive that could help us in our voting? And a lot of folks like that, but then if you said, but they wouldn't do it. but they wouldn't do it. I said, what if you said, well, you like to say we have a relationship, and you like to talk about us having coffee and stuff, right? What if you say, if you don't do that this fall, don't expect our choir in the spring? What is this going to do to these relationships between black and white churches?
Diana, do you want to comment any on the pastors in the main line? Are they talking more or what?
It's interesting that we both kind of are sitting here together with this set of questions between us. The situation in white mainline churches is in some ways a bit more complex than describing it what's going on with evangelical churches, because it's a 60-40 situation. And those are national numbers. And one of the things that is true about the main line is it's very driven denominationally, and it's also very driven locally. And so not every congregation is going to be a 60-40 congregation or a 50-50 congregation. They're going to be very different depending upon the denomination. The UCC, the United Church of Christ, and the Episcopal Church are the two most blue, the ones that are the most liberal, care the most about liberal issues, and are voting more and more and more Democratic on a regular basis. And the Lutherans, or I was surprised by this, the PCUSA, the Presbyterians, and I think it's the Methodists are the two most divided, with the Lutherans kind of someplace in the middle. So that's a complex thing, is that you start looking at each one of these denominations and having to ask what happens. But all in all, I'd say the tenor in the main line is the pastors are actually terrified. And they do not know what to do with this. Some of them are facing 50-50 congregations. And they're facing all of this in a situation when their denominations are putting enormous pressure on them about church decline and actually needing to hold on to the bodies, the physical bodies of every single mainline church member in order to keep the denominations afloat financially, et cetera. And so the pressure for these pastors to not speak to anything controversial is enormous. These are older congregations, and so they're also very given to what I call Republican nostalgia. And they're divided by family. But my email every single day has at least one, if not a half dozen or more, pastors who are literally saying to me, I don't know what to do, please help. And the clergy are in the main line, by and large, hugely outstripping the laity, opposed to Christian nationalism, engaged in issues of race, and they care about environmental concerns and gender issues. So the clergy is very liberal, the congregations are incredibly split, and there's a terror that is attached to it of denominational situations where their churches are closing. So it's really painful. And I think some of the pastors that I do work with would be sad to hear this story about a failure of relationship, because I sure know any number of great mainline pastors who are in places like Atlanta are holding on to those relationships with their Black colleagues, like they're lifelines, whereas others are just sort of letting it all go and trying to ignore it.
And I'll just speak to how the landscape has shifted because I do racial justice work. So the only ones who invite me to speak at their churches anymore are mainline, Methodist, Episcopal, you name it. Evangelical churches, no. And my sense is that, and also that goes for colleges and universities as well. That used to be my most frequent stop for speaking would be Christian colleges and universities. And I don't get those invitations anymore. And my sense is there are always the far right extremes who are completely opposed to sort of any sort of racial progress, or in political terms, any conception that one might be a good, upstanding Christian and not vote Republican. There are those colleges. My sense is that a majority of these churches and institutions are scared.
Yeah.
They're scared to even have the conversation. Mm-hmm. They're scared of being labeled left, liberal, woke, and then those donor dollars go away. The people go away. And so that level of fear, which then turns into complacency, which then turns into complicity, I think with white Christians is a big old thing. And the last thing is I am just pounding my head against a wall saying that there is more than one way to approach political theology. And by the way, there's an entire tradition in this country that grew up in direct opposition to racism and white supremacy. I wonder,
Where would that be?
maybe we could learn something from them. So there's two ways of being racist, acts of commission and acts of omission. So we know the acts of commission, you call Haitian immigrants, stealing and eating pets, right? Completely false, right? But I think the greater issue among many white Christians is an act of omission, completely doing an end around the Black Christian tradition, which is by no means perfect. But on this race stuff, there's a lot we can contribute if folks would have the humility to learn.
I have a sincere question about that. Some of the white leaders that I know are well aware of that tradition, but they're actually afraid to preach on it or use it as a theological basis for fear of appropriation.
That's interesting.
What would you say to people like that?
I say if you fear appropriation, then you're probably okay. It's the people. It's the people who don't even think about it that are the ones who are the problem.
So homework it was pretty good people.
Yeah,
then,
give the proper attribution, do your homework, do a deep dive, don't have a superficial understanding of it. But let's spread the word.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about this terror and fear. I was in Atlanta at the Candler School of Theology.
Hey, my alma mater.
All right.
You're at home school with a bunch of young pastors from all over the South, black and white. Now, the black pastors were really pleading with the white pastors to tell the truth about racism, about the history. Please tell the truth. And the white pastors, young white pastors, most of whom probably would have a Black Lives Matter sign on their front lawn, their response to that pleading for the truth was to talk about risk. Truth versus risk. And I heard things like, I need that parsonage to take care of my kids.
Yes.
Young female pastor.
Yeah.
My senior pastor says, when you preach, remember the demographics of our donors. I'm afraid of losing my members.
Just like Jesus.
My job, my pension. So on the one side, it was pleading for truth from black pastors. On the other side, these are all liberal folks, sort of. And they said, I'm afraid to do that. The terror, so fear is active on both sides. Right now, if you're black in Springfield, Haitian or not, you're afraid, reasonably afraid. But people on the more open side, they're afraid to speak to this because of losing their churches. The fear is operating on both sides.
Absolutely. I mean, this is certainly the case, not just churches, I mean, pastors across denominations. I also hear so many stories. I have a lot of people who write to me privately who cannot publicly show any association with me. Christian colleges, Christian universities, not surprised that Jemar's not getting the invites anymore. And why not? Did they change their opinion of Jemar? Or did they see how ruthlessly he was attacked and schools were attacked by this right wing for having him at an educational institution as a scholar, right? So this is, again, these are strategies here, and they are working exceedingly well. And the only way you defeat those strategies is you just stand against them. You take the hits, and we have far too few leaders of organizations, pastors, and leaders of religious denominations who are just ready to take the hits. Because what happens if you don't? What happens if you cave because of your donors, because of your constituents, just because you just don't want to handle the controversy, right? They're going to ask for more, and then they're going to ask for more, and then you absolutely lose your integrity. You lose your prophetic witness if you ever had one, and again, they will come back. And I think that there has been a sad lack of courage. That often people, if it gets too heated or if it gets to the risks are too high, they either shut things down completely or they quietly leave the institution, quietly, not calling out what's happening. And so this festers and it gets worse and worse. And the other side sees that it's working, and they do more. They do more. The only way to fight it is to stand firmly against it. And that's why I'm glad that we have this statement, clear statement in defense of democracy that acknowledges in it for some people signing this is going to bring on risk, real risk, losing that parsonage, losing the health benefits, right? Losing that income. But for goodness sake, what are you here to do? What are we here to do? And so this is one small thing, an act of courage, but just think if thousands of pastors, thousands of heads of Christian organizations would say enough is enough, right? And we're going to create space for ourselves and for each other and come at us.
You know, guess whose name came up in this Candler conversation with these black and white pastors? This is all going on about risk and fear. And one of them said, is this a Bonhoeffer moment? Is this a confessing church moment where people have to do that? To stand up with risk? And no historical periods are the same, but history does rhyme, as Mark Twain says. And you know, on the looking down the roadside, I do run into, I'm doing all these podcasts with the ex-evangelicals, the new evangelicals, the post-evangelicals. I'm waiting for the adjacent evangelicals.
That's me.
So there is this fervor rising up, and I think there are a lot of young believers, young white believers that I talk to, who are more and more ready to join with black and brown leaders in the church to literally create a new American church beyond an election, to say this is deeper than just winning and losing. This is what the church is going to be. And there's going to be a whole new configuration of what we mean by church. Our version of a confessing church or a remnant church. So I hear that bubbling up among particularly young people.
I kind of always resent that a little bit. I mean, Bonhoeffer is a great example. I love Bonhoeffer. I'm wildly influenced by him. Read so many of the books he's written. Letters and Papers from Prison is my actual favorite. But when we want to say this is a Bonhoeffer moment, who are we looking at? A German white guy who is from an incredibly privileged family. And it's like, that becomes our idea of courage. You know, actually.
That's fair.
Yeah, it is fair.
And he went to Abyssinian Baptist on Sunday.
Right, and he did learn
which changed his black preaching, black churches, black.
But what about the quiet people who were brave in their own locales over and over and over again, who persisted, whose names will never be known to historians?
Right.
That's what history is made of, even more than the memory of the few great people whose memories do come down to us for good reasons, and they're often great people. But it's not a Bonhoeffer moment; it's our moment.
Right. So that's what they're asking. Is this for us? What does that mean for us to be that kind of moment for us? How do we find the courage to stand up, as you were saying?
Well, first of all, what courage, it doesn't take that much courage yet, right? We are not in 1942 Germany.
Yeah.
We are not. And
Use your parsonage, use your pension.
exactly, some health benefits, which obviously have real implications, but let's be clear here. The more that we do right now, the less we may have to do down the road. This is our time to act.
Yeah.
And so I just want to make that very clear, right? The risks that we're talking about, they are real risks.
Yeah.
And I know many people who have lost jobs because they did take a stand. But that is very different from what Bonhoeffer was facing.
Yeah, they were raising that because they're feeling that stuff.
Yes,
And we should say, too, that had the previous generation
exactly.
done this,
Early 30s.
really, in the 30s or in the 60s,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
We would have to be doing less of it.
Exactly.
Right? Because we have kicked this can down the road in the white Christian church. We just have, right? We sort of papered it over a little bit, and maybe we make a little shift, and we put out the right press release, and maybe we show up to the right march. But at the end of the day, the fundamental dynamics didn't shift. My favorite example of this is in the same year, the National Council of Churches invites Martin Luther King Jr. to come pray right at their big meeting, and in the same year, the Episcopal school in Atlanta denies admission to his kid on the basis of race, right? In the same year. And all those people that quietly left white Christian churches, pastors that got driven out during the civil rights movement because they wanted to integrate their church and their congregation wouldn't, we're still picking up the pieces, right, of a unwillingness to really deal with that problem as it's come to head. Reconstruction, 20s and 30s, the 60s, there were these moments, and we're in another one, right, I think, now.
I said to my students this week, we lack a theology of proximity. We lack that kind of proximity that really does change people's hearts and minds. And we're structured to prevent that proximity. When the U.S. government gave my dad and mom an FHA loan and a GI Bill for a house and education, they made my family middle class. No black sailors on my dad's ship got that. No black GIs. A strategically geographic decision made my church white, my school white, my neighborhood white. I want to put a question out. We're all wrestling with this. We all signed the statement, which is great. You're all speaking at this summit. Your voices are so important. Today, as we're sitting here, there are 46 days until the election. And early voting has already started in some states. So what is it that keeps each of you up at night? And what is it that gives you any hope? What keeps you up at night? And what gives you any hope? Maybe you're all sleeping really well.
No,
Not at all.
for me, what keeps me up at night, honestly, is my calendar and a constant panic that I'm dropping a ball, I'm forgetting something because it seems all so urgent right now, and my schedule is so packed because, again, what we do now could matter so much for what we are going to have to do, may have to do on the other side of this election. And so whenever I feel like I'm really tired, this is too much, I remind myself of that. It's easy right now. I mean, it's a lot, but we have our freedoms. We have our voices. We have our platforms. We have our message. And we know that the election is going to be razor thin. Or at least we think it will be. All signs point to that, right? So everything matters. And we as people of faith know that there are other causes, other ideologies, other forces fighting for those faith voters. And I just want to get in there and give people something to chew on. Remind them of their theology. Remind them of where they come from. Remind them of those core values. And then see where things go. What gives me hope is strength and community. And it's not just those of us who are on the table, although this is a source of strength. Everywhere I go, everybody who takes a risk, everybody who pays a price, I do not know one person who regrets it, even if they've lost that income,
That's a good point.
because they found that community and that strength in community.
I'll jump in. There's a sort of image that just keeps coming to me that and it's an election day worry. And it is that we're going to see a body count on election day. And that it in my head, what it basically is a majority black precinct and white supremacist armed people showing up as quote unquote poll watchers, right? Because they've been influenced by Trump to do that, fully armed to the teeth. And it's just a powder keg, right? All it takes is one shoving match, a few crosswords, and 20 rounds of an AR-15 going off, and there we are. So I'm really worried about it. And I know that there are, Jim, I know you and others are involved in bringing kind of clergy to the polls, right? To kind of be a different kind of presence, a calming presence, a literally disarming presence, at the polls. That work is so important. So that's what I'm worried about, what keeps me up. And the data that we're seeing about the support for political violence, right? That we have 1 in 3 Republicans telling us that they could foresee the need for political violence to save the country. 1 in 3 Christian nationalists saying that today. But on the other side, what gives me hope, I think, is I do think that there are people, if we kind of get down to local communities, we're getting torn apart from up here, I think. And I think when you get down to local communities, there is more hope. And like when I'm on the ground, I'm talking to a church or even a university, it's clear that there are networks of connection. They're being frayed for sure and being tested and stretched. But I think at the local level, that's where I find that we hold things together, is down at the local level. And churches have a hugely important part to play, but they're going to have to play it really intentionally.
The thing I think that keeps me up the most is the fact that we are living in different universes of reality. And that's a pretty big thing to have. Maybe I should be a fellow at the Philosophy Center in Notre Dame this year. But that is one of the things that really worries me, is that how in the world can we ever even hope to stitch this all back together if we're not in the same ballpark of reality? And that really disturbs me, and it does keep me up. The place where I'm finding hope is that I'm actually working on a book about sort of what I would call the lost saints of American history. And so it echoes in some senses a little bit of the book.
Can't wait to read it.
You just did. And just this last, so everywhere I'm going, all these different places, one of the things I've done is ask every single conference organizer to take me to some place in their town that surprises me about something they've learned in history in their city that they did not know, that's been newly talked about. And so people were taking me all kinds of amazing places. And this last weekend in Wilmington, Delaware, I mentioned I was up there. I went to 2 places that I walked away from feeling great about. One was the Garrett Tubman Memorial Park, right behind Union Station, the train station in Wilmington, Delaware. And there is this, what used to be just a kind of a seedy, kind of warehouse kind of area, is now a beautiful park right on the Delaware River. And at the center of it is a statue of Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett. And Tubman, most people know her by now, but Thomas Garrett was a white man, an abolitionist, and he worked very closely with Tubman and the Underground Railroad in Wilmington, Delaware, and was eventually credited with the transit of 27,000 people out of slavery to northern cities and to Canada. And one of the things that is so cool about the statue is that, and it's a very recent statue done by an Asian American artist, is that Tubman is standing just so gloriously strong right there on the river's edge, and she's holding a baby in her hand. And Garrett is kneeling next to her, and he's pointing the way through the wilderness. And so it's the real centering of the person who should be centered, Tubman, and the support of this white elite guy, this Quaker leader from Delaware. I recommend anybody go and see this. And then I went to the courthouse where he was tried because he broke the fugitive slave law. And the fellow who was the judge in his case was Roger Taney, who of course we know later will decide the Dred Scott case. And Taney had no sympathy to Thomas Garrett when he was brought before him for breaking that law, and fined him such an exorbitant amount of money, it's equivalent to about $100,000 in today's money. Basically broke the back of tried to break the back of his anti-slavery work. And when the verdict was announced, Thomas Garrett stood up and he said, "You think this will stop me?" He said, "I have only started." And so courage and historical courage in the telling of those public histories that have by and large been obscured or lost. And so I'm asking people now everywhere I go to show me something.
Such a good idea.
Yeah.
Such a cool idea.
And it's been amazing.
What keeps me up is the day after the election. A lot of people that I talk to, you know, the actual election is the stopping point. That's when it all be decided. And I'm like, no, that's an end to one phase and a new beginning to another that feels completely unpredictable. If Trump continues to this day to refuse the legitimate results of the 2020 election, what makes us think he's going to accept a result he doesn't like in 2024?
And 2/3 of Republicans still believe it.
And so he's got an army, you know, so to speak, behind him, ready to prop up any lies that he may spew. So that goes to the political violence piece. That goes to the misinformation piece. Whatever happened to the 9th commandment? Don't bear false witness, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it does matter who wins, but in terms of the chaos and the unpredictability, it doesn't matter who wins. It's still going to be chaotic and unpredictable what happens. And so I really feel like, you know, an assistant coach trying to get the team ready for the big game, and they're staying up late and they're lackadaisical at practice, and the big game's going to come and they're just going to get rolled over. So I'm just like, y'all, we got to buckle down. We got 46 days as we record this. And that's only to get us to 1 point.
Yeah.
And then we got to be ready for whatever comes next. So that's what keeps me up. What, you know, encourages me, give me hope.
Yeah.
It's the community. It's knowing that both historically and biblically, it's always been a remnant. God somehow always uses that mustard seed, that small group of people to make an enormous impact. And I think that's still true today, despite the headlines, despite, you know, all of the legitimate fears we have. It's what I call the spirit of justice that's present in every age and rises up in a people who says right is right and wrong is wrong. And we're going to put ourselves on the line and have that courage to stand up for ourselves and our neighbors.
I was scrolling through the Zoom call screen on the Paul Chaplain training 2 nights ago. Hundreds of people were on that call, being trained at de-escalation, information, support, common presence, and all the rest. They're there. And we're now keeping until after the election, all the way to January 20th, until we know who's inaugurated.
Yeah.
Here's a bit of hope. We've all had the experience of not being invited back to something. So that's typical. But,
Welcome to the club.
Doing something right.
but I was really sad one day when they not only didn't invite me back, they fired the chaplain who invited me to come.
Right.
He had 3 kids. I got to know the guy. The chapel loved it, students, faculty, but the donors and board didn't like it. And they fired him. So I felt really terrible when I got this guy fired. So I kept in touch and calling. Finally he says, Jim, he says, stop calling me. I'm doing fine.
Yeah.
I had time when I was fired to look around, and I always drove under this bridge where there was all these homeless people. I just drove by and said, that's sad. Finally I had time to stop. And so I started stopping and meeting people and talking to people and said, any of you go to church? Well, we used to, but we couldn't go now. We're homeless and all that. So I want to tell you, Jim, that we've just started the church under the bridge for homeless people. And what I found that what you said in that sermon that got me fired about Matthew 25, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me, I feel closer to Christ than I've ever felt in my whole career in the new church under the bridge. So what we're saying to people is true.
Yeah.
Don't just not follow bad religion, but if you come closer to Christ,
That's it.
there's a joy.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a joy in this. And there's a joy for me in just being with you and hanging out and talking like this and listen to all their voices and their books. These people are really changing. It doesn't seem like that every night when you look at your schedule, but these voices are changing a lot. So I'm just grateful for all of you. And thank you all for listening.